Personal jurisdiction, often abbreviated as PJ, is a foundational concept in civil procedure. It refers specifically to the court's power over the defendant. Before any court can issue a binding judgment against a party, it must possess this authority. Without proper personal jurisdiction, any judgment rendered is void. This requirement is not merely a procedural rule. It is constitutionally mandated. Personal jurisdiction is rooted deeply in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. This constitutional requirement ensures that exercising jurisdiction over a defendant is fundamentally fair. Due process acts as a constitutional check on state power. When we analyze personal jurisdiction, we are essentially asking whether it is fair to require this particular defendant to defend themselves in this particular forum. This fairness analysis dictates the boundaries of judicial power across state lines, which we will explore in detail throughout this series, starting with the concept of state-specific authority. To understand the modern fairness analysis, we must first look backward to the historical rule that governed jurisdiction for nearly a century. This framework was established by the Supreme Court in the landmark case of Pennoyer v. Neff in 1878. Under Pennoyer, jurisdiction was strictly territorial. A court could only exercise power over a defendant if that defendant was physically present within the state's borders when served, or if the defendant had property within the state that could be attached. This physical presence rule worked adequately when commerce was local, relying primarily on stagecoaches and physical movement. However, the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent explosion of interstate and international commerce rendered this physical presence requirement obsolete. As businesses began operating across state lines through mail, rail, and later, electronic means, requiring physical presence to establish fairness simply no longer reflected commercial reality. This obsolescence paved the way for the modern constitutional approach we will examine next. The limitations of the territorial approach became undeniable, leading the Supreme Court to fundamentally reshape personal jurisdiction in 1945. The pivotal decision was International Shoe Company v. Washington. This case established the modern constitutional standard that governs jurisdiction today. International Shoe held that for a state court to exercise jurisdiction over an out-of-state defendant, the defendant must possess certain minimum contacts with the forum state. This is the crucial threshold. Furthermore, the exercise of that jurisdiction must not offend traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. Think of this as a two-part constitutional hurdle. First, are there sufficient contacts? Second, even if contacts exist, is jurisdiction fundamentally fair? This dual requirement, minimum contacts coupled with fairness, is the bedrock upon which all subsequent personal jurisdiction analysis is built. The first, and often most critical, component of the minimum contacts analysis is purposeful availment. This concept demands that the defendant must have deliberately reached out to the forum state. Jurisdiction is proper only if the defendant's conduct shows they purposefully availed themselves of the privilege of conducting activities within the forum state, thus invoking the benefits and protections of its laws. This deliberate action is what makes litigation therefore foreseeable. We must contrast purposeful actions, like actively soliciting sales or entering into contracts targeted at residents, with actions that are merely random, fortuitous, or unilateral. If the plaintiff unilaterally injects themselves or their property into the forum state, that action alone cannot create the necessary contact for the defendant. The defendant must be the one aiming for the forum state, ensuring that being sued there is not a surprise. Now that we have established purposeful availment, we must categorize the resulting jurisdiction. If the contacts are sufficient, jurisdiction can be either specific or general. Specific jurisdiction is the narrower category. It applies only when the lawsuit itself arises out of or relates to the defendant's contacts with the forum state. Think of it this way. The very reason the defendant is subject to suit here is because of the specific transaction or occurrence that took place within the state boundaries. For example, if a manufacturer sells a defective product that injures someone in the forum state, or if a defendant breaches a contract negotiated and to be performed entirely within that state, specific jurisdiction likely exists. The claim must flow directly from the contact. This is a much more focused inquiry than general jurisdiction, which we will cover next. Now we turn to the broader category, general jurisdiction. Unlike specific jurisdiction, where the claim must arise from the contacts, general jurisdiction permits the forum state to exercise power over the defendant for any claim, even if the underlying events occurred entirely outside the state. This is often referred to as jurisdiction everywhere. The Supreme Court significantly narrowed the scope of general jurisdiction in the Daimler case, establishing the modern at-home test. For corporations, being at home means the company is subject to general jurisdiction only in its state of incorporation or the state where it has its principal place of business, often called the corporate headquarters. For individuals, the equivalent concept is domicile, the place where they reside with the intent to remain indefinitely. The key takeaway is that general jurisdiction is extremely rare for corporations, requiring them to be essentially present everywhere they operate, which the law generally restricts to those two specific locations. A mere branch office, no matter how substantial, will not suffice. Now, even if minimum contacts are established, the analysis under international shoe is not complete. The second, crucial prong requires that exercising jurisdiction must also comport with traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. This is the reasonableness or fairness analysis. The Supreme Court outlined several factors to weigh here. First, consider the burden imposed upon the defendant. If the defendant is extremely distant, forcing them to litigate here imposes a significant burden. Second, we examine the forum state's interest in adjudicating the dispute. Does the state have a strong policy reason to hear this case? Third, we look at the plaintiff's interest in obtaining convenient and effective relief. These three elements are weighed against each other, often visualized as a set of balancing scales. We have now covered the constitutional requirements for personal jurisdiction, minimum contacts, and fairness. However, jurisdiction is also a defense that the defendant must actively assert. If the defendant fails to raise the defense of lack of personal jurisdiction properly and timely, they waive it. This is a critical procedural trap. Under the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, a defendant typically challenges personal jurisdiction by filing a motion to dismiss under Rule 12, subsection B, paragraph 2. Alternatively, some states allow a special appearance solely to contest jurisdiction. The key is timing and form. If the defendant files an answer or a motion that addresses the merits of the case, such as a motion for summary judgment, without first asserting the jurisdictional defense, they have made a general appearance. This general appearance cures any prior jurisdictional defect. Think of it like a formal document being stamped, accepted. Once you participate generally, the court has power over you for this case. Failure to raise this defense early means you lose the right to challenge jurisdiction later. Having established that the defense of personal jurisdiction can be waived through a general appearance, let us now synthesize the entire analytical framework required to establish jurisdiction constitutionally. For exam success, memorize this 5-step checklist. First, does the state's long-arm statute reach the defendant? Second, if yes, has the defendant purposefully availed themselves of the forum state, creating minimum contacts? Third, If contacts exist, are they sufficient for specific jurisdiction, meaning the claim arises from the contacts, or general jurisdiction, meaning the defendant is essentially at home there? Fourth, even if contacts are established, do the fairness factors, burden on the defendant, state interest, and plaintiff convenience, support jurisdiction? Finally, ensure the defense was not waived by a general appearance. Follow this sequence, and you will master personal jurisdiction analysis for the Uniform Bar Examination.